I don't know if any of you follow Bryan on Twitter and saw him tweet yesterday about Nicole, but a kind of a collective awe went through our office as it went through everyone's feeds. So I have to read it really quickly. Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm sorry. In 2016, I kind of stopped writing, but then Nicole emailed me to say she liked my writing and would I be interested in writing more things. So I said, wow, okay. And then I just kept doing that, and now there's a book. So I'm not sure that there's much more that I can add to introduce the wonderful creative relationship between these two writers, except to say how much I too have loved following Bryan's evolution through his work at the All, through Catapult's Story, the Bayou Diaries, Paris Review, and the New Yorker, and now into this shimmering, devastating document. I feel like if I personally had to create a Mad Libs of things that I long to read about in fiction, it would include work, which I think we don't read about nearly enough in fiction, the kind of everyday effects of gentrification, which it's interesting to be here in Union Market. It's something we can be very honest about and kind of get into, I hope. Sex, place, and tacos. And Lot has it all, and in prose that's simultaneously razor sharp and kind of jarringly tender. And I think it's such a gift to us. Nicole, of course, herself is the editor of Catapult magazine and is the author of a critically acclaimed National Book Critics Circle finalist memoir, All You Can Ever Know. Please welcome Bryan and Nicole.
There you go. Do I need to, so if there's one, do I need to talk into the mic or can I just talk? I do need some scissors. Okay. No, that's too much hand-eye coordination. I'm just gonna drop something and it's gonna be a fucking disaster. Thank y'all for coming out this evening. I haven't been in DC very long. I think this is actually like my 7th hour in the city, but it seems like y'all have got a lot of cool stuff going on. So thank you for making it out to this specifically. This event and the one tomorrow are actually really special for me. Like they're kind of, there are people in the audience without whom the book really wouldn't have come together. So I guess first and foremost, thanks to the bookstore, right? Like, I think indie bookstores are deeply important. If you're here, then you probably also subscribe to that notion. But they cultivate and create the communities that I'm interested in living in and being in. So the fact that they're willing to host me, that the fact that they're willing to host other people, that they have Nicole here, I think that means a lot. It's really cool. It's a big thing. So, thank you all for doing what you do. First specific thank you, Paul Asta is here. He wrote a poem that is one of the epigraphs in the book. And while I was writing the book, there was a conception I had of the recurring narrator that didn't really make sense to me until I read that poem. And then it made sense to me. It's kind of crazy how you read other things and then what you're trying to work on just sort of works, yeah? So, thanks for making it out. Thank you for your words. We talked a little bit about Nicole. I was just gonna pull up the tweet myself and read it, but I'm not gonna, just don't be sorry. I'm just not gonna do that anymore. But in all seriousness, we're in 2019 now, so in 2016, I was kind of like done. Like I was like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore, that kind of thing. And Nicole reached out, like it was really out of the blue. And in as many words, really just like, I enjoy what you're doing. Do you want to do more of it? That sort of thing. It's like a small thing, but it's the sort of thing that obviously can reap dividends and you can return to it and then you could get to talk about it maybe with Nicole 3 years later. So really, really excited that Nicole made it out and really I'm glad that y'all made it out. It's super cool. What I've been doing in every other city, I guess what I'll do this evening, I'm going to read a little bit, maybe about 12, 13 minutes. So 2 very long YouTube music videos, right? Just to give you an idea of what you're going to be. Because I just don't like it when people read for too long, even people I really like, because like after 15 minutes, everybody just sort of checks out. So I'll read 3 different things. They're all going to be really short. You're not going to need any context going into any of them, except for maybe a sentence or 2 at a time. One of the things that I'm going to read is a little bit of a story called Bayou. So it was a story that is not the longest by any means, but it took one of the longest efforts to write, partly because I was really interested in this idea of like a magical thing happening in a neighborhood where magic might not immediately be associated with. right? Like usually in my reading and like my movie watching and my TV watching, when I think of magic happening in a place, it's like three white kids, specifically like three white boys, and then they fall in a pothole, and then like they're in Narnia, oh no, or like they end up in the upside down, or they come across I don't know, two guys come across a ring, and then they travel through a fictional village or a fictional universe fighting black people, and it's just really confusing, right? So I wondered what happened if you had that sort of magical element, but it took place in a place that might not immediately be associated with it. Yeah. So two guys have found a chupacabra and it's dead, and they don't know what to do with it. That's an hour later. It coughed. Fuck, said Mix. He was barefoot and he poked it with a hairy toe, and the chupacabra's torso sort of deflated and its chest began to rise and sink again. And Mix reached for my phone, but I told him I had to jet. And he said, "You have to work. I give you the gift of modern mystery, and you dodge it to sweep for fucking gabachos." And I said, "Gabachos tip better than anyone else." And Mix said, "You've got no class, got no vision." And I said, "Mix, I don't have a checking account, I don't have a savings account, I don't have a PayPal, I don't have a Venmo, I have to work, I don't have a choice." And Mick said, "Hijo de puta, motherfuckers always have a choice." And he popped a squat with my cell phone and he snapped like 12 photos for Instagram, and the flash had both of us wincing as he flipped through the filters. Mix was short for Mix Coata, which is a name that I've never heard him pronounce. And the one place you saw his name was on his name tag for the sushi shack where we both worked. And he only wore the fucking thing because no one else could say his name. And if no one else could say his name, then no one else could ask him to do anything. He'd stand at the counter for hours, handing back incorrect change, dipping his fingers in everyone's rice, and sighing at all of our customers. "Tadaris," he said, "this is our big break. We make ourselves fucking viral with this thing right here." So Mick stepped around Chupacabra, holding the phone and snapping photo after photo, and he lifted its legs and he flipped the body on its side, and the Chupacabra wheezed a little, jerking its ears, and that's when Mick flew back his hand, but it had only begun to snore. So we unclenched and we exhaled. And I said, "Mix, if it wakes up with a paycheck, then I'll stay." And Mix said, "You don't fucking get it. You don't get it. Let's say we break even with this. Let's say we go big." He said, "I'm keeping your phone." And I said, "You will go ahead and you hold your breath." And when I asked him why he wanted to keep my phone, he told me to jumpstart my brain. He said, "I'm going to call the fucking Houston Chronicle. I'm going to call the fucking mayor, fucking Beto O'Rourke, fucking KUHF. Monsters and A-Leaf," he said. "You can't make that shit up." And I said, "Mix, but you probably could." And I said, "It was probably just a spicy raccoon." And Mix said, "Go off and play kitchen." He was already dialing on his phone. He said, "Go play the other man, earn some pennies for your bastard." And I said, "Hey man, you fuck all the way off with that." And Mix said, "It's not like you don't already know." And I started to say that knowing something didn't give you license to shout it, like how I knew that Mix was queer, but it wasn't something that we talked about. But then the Chupacabra opened its eyes, and the two of us jumped, and then Mix fell on his ass, and I fell right beside him. And the Chupacabra looked up at the both of us, and we froze. We held our breath. The Chupacabra had talons like gloss talc, and they tore at the grass, and it shivered sort of as if though the humidity weren't shit to it at all. And the Chupacabra could have been hungry or thirsty or lost or maybe all of those things or maybe none of them at all. And I looked at Mix to tell him, like, we should totally leave it alone. Like, we've all seen this movie before. We've been in this movie. We know exactly what's going to happen to us. Its crew is going to come back for it, and, we know what's going to go on. And that's when Mix caught my eye. And I thought we had an understanding, but he lifted a single finger, and then he was on the phone popping off about what a fucking discovery we had just made. Yeah, so that's the first one. The next one is a story called Fanon. Okay, so I have my editor. Her name is Laura. She's really great at what she does. She also edits a lot of books, right? So after the first iteration or the first pass of Lot, she told me, "Hey Brian, we have a ghost story in the book," and I think that you may have heard me talk a little bit about this at Winter Institute. But in my head, I'm like, okay, like I didn't write a fucking ghost story for this book. Like, so clearly you've mixed up the names, or like you've done something wrong with some sort of transition that hasn't taken place. And it's my first book, so I can't say anything. But when I was going through edits, I had like a really antiquated notion, I suppose, of like what a ghost story could be, right? Talking about this neighborhood in itself. I mean, I imagine if you grew up here or if you saw what it was 5 years ago, it is very much not that thing now, right? So in a sense, it is a ghost town, and you don't have to have a barren area or a place with brambles sort of rolling through it in order to have the remnants of what something was, right? Like you yourself were probably someone completely different 6 months ago, and you yourself are going to be somebody completely different 6 months from now. So you have ghosts of selves, you have different ghosts of people, and I think all of those can contribute to a ghost story, like or what it is or what it can be. Yeah. So this is the book's ghost story. I've sort of come to terms with that. And you don't really need to know anything other than that the narrator is a young woman. Yeah. Everything is different now, but for a while I lived off of Fannin. Yolanda and I rented this piss yellow walk up. It's still behind the fire station right before the bars, and we both worked at the museum downtown. It was my third or fourth job since I'd left the restaurant, and one morning we were driving back drunk from the clubs when I saw my father walking up the road. It was 2 or 3 past midnight. We hadn't had any luck at Liberty Station or Juleps, just the usual goons looking for ass on a Sunday, although it would be a few more years before I stopped looking myself. Yolanda was driving, and I said, "Stop. Please stop." And Jan said, "Fuck, you're crazy, just wow, but it's cool. You know, some weekends you win and some weekends you don't, and that's no reason to lower the bar for these motherfuckers." Yolanda was driving then. She was talking about some other fucking thing about me not having a man or having them and losing them, but I didn't care about that. Not really. I didn't. Don't. So I reached for the steering wheel, a little fucked up, a little high, and Yolanda finally opened her eyes when she realized that I was serious, and she stopped on the brakes, and we both sort of flew. Any further down the road, and we would have hit the tracks, and Yolanda's car slowed a bit by margaritas to go. She told me to cool it, to calm the fuck down, so I inhaled a bit, and I cooled it, just calm down. I looked back at the man on the road because, of course, sometimes people see things. Your eyes will show you what they want to, whatever they think that you should see. They'll show you a happy family when all you have is bodies and a room. They'll show you a man worth walking out on your whole fucking life for, a man who will leave you with 3 kids and a half-rotting lot, but because your eyes are your eyes and you only know what you know, you will not see the train until it finally hits you. So I said, "That's him." And Yolanda said, "Who?" And I said, "My father," and Yolanda blinked before she laughed. Yolanda used to share her apartment with some fucking guy, but then that fucking guy moved out and I filled in with the rest of the rent. Most nights we'd hit the Heights, or we'd dance with the gays out in Montrose, or we'd take shots downtown, or we'd strut through the Galleria, and no matter where we went, everyone thought that we were supposed to be there. The white boys I found in Midtown didn't know that my brother sold smoke. The Filipinos from the medical district didn't know my mother couldn't cope, and I had an Afghani guy once and his fingers felt like chocolate, and for a minute I lived with him on the 9th floor of Hotel Zaza, but then his visa went up and he had to fly back home, and he asked to take me with him. He actually offered to fly me back, and he didn't know that my other brother sucked more dick than the peddlers on Wa, or that my mother spent whole months crying because of it. But no one knew these things, and what I didn't do was tell them. It took me a while to figure out that we're only who we allow ourselves to be. But my father, he had on these tattered khakis, he had boots with holes in the heels. And I opened the door with Yolanda screaming her lungs out behind me, and my father sped up when he saw me coming, and then he looked again, and then he was running, but this happened back when I was light, the lightest that I had ever been. And I had no mother, no brothers, no father, no one to hold me back. So I walked down my father, and I grabbed him by the shoulders. And I said, "Hey," pulling at his jacket. I said, "Look at me," and I said, "Hey." My father, he smelled like trash. And he swept at my hands. He had filthy hair, he had slumped shoulders, and his fingers cracked like firewood. He said my name once, and then once again, and then I realized that it was just Yolanda pulling at my shoulders. She settled behind me, kneeling on the asphalt. She stared at my father, and he looked at me, and I looked at Yolanda, and then the man beneath me, and he blinked at the two of us, and he said, "Jesus fuck, what are you doing?" "What the shit?" he said. And Yolanda said, "She's sorry, she's so fucking sorry." And I said it too, and I tried to mean it. But I wasn't sorry because it was my father. Now, maybe just for a second, maybe he was there and then he was gone, but that didn't mean that he was never there at all. In the car back home, Yolanda didn't say much about it. She said, "It happens to the best of us." She was pulling at her hair. She said, "Did I ever tell you about Lamar? He had me running in circles too, chasing girls out into the street. But," said Yolanda, "one day you just get tired. One day you just end up done with all that." Yeah, so that's the end of the second one, right? So there's one more. And it is... Actually, no, I'm not going to read that. I'm going to read something else. So we had a storm pass through Houston a few years ago, and you may have heard about it. It left some pretty big indentions across the neighborhood. particularly neighborhoods that were in the midst of a number of changes elsewhere. But one thing that I thought was pretty interesting and remarkable in a way is that there were pockets that weren't affected at all, right? And one of them was this little park. It's called Peggy Park, and it's in the center of Midtown, Houston. And it's a space where you can see the city's diversity in action in a way that I think that you hear about if you don't live in the city, but actually conceptualizing it can be tricky, right? To actually just see it as a whole other thing. It's not a very large space. There's a basketball court. There's a soccer field. There's a tiny taqueria. There's like a vegan stand. Like they're there on like Wednesdays, and sometimes they're not there. So if you go there looking for them, you might not find them. And they just sort of made a way to exist prior to the storm. And after the storm, while whole swaths of that part of town took months to sort of rehabilitate and come back together, they were repopulated, I suppose, within a few days. Yeah, which was remarkable, partly because Houston moves on its own time, and it's hard to say what it means when people do things that quickly, and probably because it was really showed, I suppose, what the city was about or what my experience of the city was about. So I wrote a story called Peggy Park. It's very short, and I'm going to read all of it, so you don't need much going into it. Yeah. Micah turned pro, and the rest of us went regular. Game started at 4:10. Sometimes we'd fuck around and wait an extra 15 minutes if the rain on Scott was heavy enough to slow the rails downtown. And that's where our guys pulled up from, or at least the motherfuckers you wanted on base, since of course the neighborhood's got idle feet all over. But mostly we were too fucked up or too strung out or too in our feelings or too busy scrapping in the parking lots on Wheeler or groping each other in the garages downtown. And if you weren't already there, then you were on your way with the quickness. But for an hour or three on Wednesday nights, we were present. We were clear in the moment. Jacoby manned the upper outfield, and now he's a mechanic or some shit. The bat was too heavy for Lenny, and today he's a drunk holding court on Westheimer. And Kendall caught, tagged, and then he had a son at 17, and then he slit his wrists over custody when he divorced like 14 years later. On the other side of the pitch, Matthew reffed on his hands and knees before they threw him in juvie, before they threw him in rehab, before they threw him who the fuck knows where. Abel had a sick hit on him, and he works at Shell now most nights after 6. But back then, on our glass-tattered field, he was almost subpar at best. LaMarcus threw the ball like a murderer. He'd nail you right in your fucking eye, or maybe that one spot in your knee, or a low full speed, mid-stride, just square in your chest. But now that motherfucker's a gardener with his boyfriend out in the Heights. Stefan's queer too, only he told us right from the outset. Tommy Lee pulled home runs from his house on the regular, but lately he's been manning this pawn shop with his sister, and the sister, her name was Passion, and she actually peeped us from the stands, and we catcalled at her, and we stuck out our tongues, and we took the side of her bug and just back home, terrified the whole time, because who knew what she'd do with us? Who knew about the power that she had? And one day, we'd been talking shit on the grass when she grabbed Abel's bat and knocked a pitch just square out the block. Right through her hands, and she ran those bases like a motherfucker. And now she's got a kid with some Vietnamese cat out in Bel Air. Demetrius Quinto was no good for catching and no good for hitting. He was just trash at movement in general. Until one day, we had him bunting, and he couldn't do that either. And now he runs a parlor on the corner of Montrose. Colby could hit, but then he went and he got strung out. Donnie hit the pipe. Nelly hit it too. Paco held third base, the only Mexican in the neighborhood, and we called him Big Mac since his folks held court at McDonald's like 7 days a week, and he was the only guy who made it out of the neighborhood. He got a full ride to Stanford and then overseas to make it back a decade later with a PhD and all the clout in the world. Jonathan and JC were reliable benchers, and Juicy was the only brother among them who did time, but Ivan did time, and Connor did time, and Bailey and Raymond and Cool Ray did time. But there was one night, just after Harvey, and the streets were all the way flooded, and you couldn't run the bases for shit, let alone wade through the dirt. But even still, we all knew our steps. It felt primal, like birth, the shit we knew how to do, and our toes grazed the asphalt, and our legs took us through it. And that night, Micah rounded the bases like a dog before he finally got his ankle stuck in a pothole by the fence. The dude fell sideways like a block of burnt wood, screaming like I don't know what. So Tommy grabbed his fingers, and Crisscross grabbed Tommy, and Dawson held Kento, and Kendall tugged Dawson, and John tagged on to JC, and I grabbed Juicy by his hips, And his Nikes wouldn't budge until passion grabbed my belt, yanking at the waist, tearing at the seams, and Kool-Aid pulled passion, and Dawson pulled Kool-Aid, and Michael flew right out of that hole. You'd think the motherfucker would have thanked us, would have looked us in the eyes with some semblance of gratitude, but what he did was take off and clear the rest of those bases. He ran through his shoes, ran through his socks, and he dove into the mass of us. And we let him do that. We let him take us to the mound. He carried us through the water and the mud all the way back home. And that might be why he's the one playing in Brooklyn and Boston and Pittsburgh and Dallas and Tucson and Austin and Cleveland and Oakland and New York. But when you catch him on ESPN or Fox Sports SW or Telemundo 40 or wherever the fuck, that we're right there with him. We're holding him up. We're pushing him toward wherever we're headed next. And that's the last one. Thank you. Should.
Use the mics for the. Okay. All right. Hello. Wow, I can't believe both of you were going to read that tweet.
Yeah, I was prepared. I didn't know, so I started reading it.
It meant a lot to me. Thank you. If you don't mind if I talk, the first time I read your work, I thought just the way you put sentences together was like something I had not really seen before. Your first essay, which is about playing high school football in Texas, still one of my favorite pieces I've ever gotten to work on. And I should say by the time you reached out, you'd been in the New York Times and and I think the New Yorkers, so it wasn't like I was the only person who loved your work. But I wanted to talk first of all about like that. You're so good at both nonfiction and fiction, and I'm always just curious. First of all, that feels like magic, unfair magic. And how do you find one easier than the other? Can you work on both at the same time? How do you navigate both those very different like styles and spaces?
I feel like they're two different energies, right? So when I'm in the middle of like a longer fiction project, having the nonfiction or having the idea of the nonfiction to work on, like sometimes just like having the idea of something else to work on, like I'm not stuck in this long fiction thing, has been really helpful. I don't know that it's easier, but it's certainly different, right? So instead of like trying to conjure someone or like a neighborhood or a place or a time or whatever else, when I'm writing memoir or nonfiction, it's like me, right? So that voice is, obviously a bit easier to sort of grab, but I think structurally it's still challenging just because a lot of what I'm trying to do, I think narratively, is just like a weird structure, right? Like, so I always have trouble like pitching people because I say it's like, it's going to start here and then it's going to end up over there and then it's going to end over there and then we're going to end up where it started. And most places say no, like fuck you, like we're not gonna do that, like on spec, no. So that's always difficult, and you don't really have that worry with fiction, right? Because I feel like, at least me, like in my experience, when I'm reading fiction, I'm a bit more, I don't know, it might be a fault of my own, like a lenient as far as like where I allow the piece to go, right, structurally. So they both have, their pros and cons, I guess, as far as like the actual work is concerned. But it is nice to dip between one and the other, right? I think it more was two different forms trying to work at the same sort of obsessions and interests.
I would love to talk about the structure of Lot too, because, first of all, speaking of magic, it actually just seems the idea of linked short story collections has always fascinated me. I feel like that is just a very, very difficult hurdle, right? Because each story does really stand on its own, and you could read them individually, but they're also all really linked beautifully. And I was wondering how you came up with the structure of sort of having this one central narrator. We follow him and his family through the story. But then we also they're not vignettes. They're whole complete stories interspersed. Sometimes they're other members of that family, sometimes not. But how did that structure come to you? How did you decide to put together the collection like this?
The short answer is that I wrote enough short stories for there to be a collection, and it made sense. It was time to sell a book, so that that was what was there. What might be the longer answer is I was really interested. I read a book called American Son by Brian Washington, and he worked with the story cycle form in a way that I hadn't really seen before, other than maybe Sandras's Notice's The House on Mango Street, right? And both of those texts are pretty integral to just trying to write what it might be like to exist in a neighborhood, right? So when I first started the book, I had in mind this idea of writing about are trying to have a story set in each of Houston's central hubs, because I think it's easier to think of Houston as a series of hubs in lieu of just sort of a mass. Like I think that can make it very difficult to write about when you're trying to approach it as a whole. And that didn't work out partly because like that's just really ambitious. Like it was just a lot for a first time writer, specifically a first time fiction writer to do, and partly because I was more, I don't know. It had me more focused on like a geographical apparatus, like approaching the text from that, or like a historical apparatus, and like trying to conjure like the neighborhoods and get every detail right, the streets and all that, and not that came at the expense of the story, right? So I wasn't paying as much attention to the story. So once I started paying, heed to the story and to the narrators and to those specific characters and their interests, their conflicts, specifically like their tinier conflicts, that's when the stories began to surface in the neighborhood. I was able to build the world around that, if that makes sense, right? Once I knew who the people were and what their problems were, just trying to conceive how a place could make them like that, or what kind of place they were operating in, made a lot more structural sense for me. And I ended up just the way that the stories were, I had enough to have every other story be a recurring story, and each of the other pieces be a sort of, not a standalone, but just different pieces of the neighborhood or different pieces of the city.
It's interesting. I know that you've lived in other places, but Houston's where you grew up, and Houston's your home now. Was Houston always central to your writing?
That's really interesting because I've been trying to think about it lately. I mean, with Lot specifically, it really wasn't a question of like whether I would set the stories in Houston or set the project in Houston. Like it just wasn't Houston. And then other people told me that that was cool and hadn't been done before. So I said, oh, okay, I guess I'll keep doing it, like whatever. But it was not really, it's strange because it wasn't a conscious thing, but obviously I was doing it. So there was some sort of import that I had onto it. But I think that now I've become more conscious of trying to imbue certain characteristics of different neighborhoods or different parts of the hubs within the city into the stories.
A lot of the justifiably glowing reviews, they've been pointing out that this book in some ways is like a love letter to Houston. And it's also a vision of a portrait of Houston we don't necessarily always see, or that maybe outsiders wouldn't think of if they don't know it. What were the really important things, not that you write a book with an agenda, but like since you decided to set this here and because this area means a lot to you, what things did you want to be sure to capture, I guess, in your fiction for people who both are of Houston and people who aren't as familiar with it?
I think that insofar as I was like looking for the things to definitely have in the text, it would be, I mean, it's fiction, so like if you write fiction, you should do whatever the fuck you want to do, because that's one of the great things about fiction. But I think it would be intellectually dishonest to have a monocultural narrative set in Houston, because that's just not emblematic of the city and it's not true to the place. And I think it would also be really fucking boring, because it's a great thing about the city that I think we're going to see more Houston narratives. Like if anything good happens from this, we will see more Houston narratives. And it's a place that's rife with different stories, right? Because like, for example, like the last thing I read, like a very specific experience of Harvey, the folks and their experiences in that particular piece would be wildly different if they were Vietnamese Americans living in Bel Air. And they would be wildly different if they were white folks living out in Pearland. It'd be wildly different if they were like black line cooks living in Midtown, right? And Houston's strange and also a little bit amazing in that you have all of those folks in the same area. So as a storyteller, there are, especially like if you're interested in conflicts and the way that conflicts can arise and dissolve, they can, it's just like rife with a lot of different stuff that you can do. So I think highlighting the city's diversity, and also another thing that I was really conscious of, and perhaps more like in press and other things now, is like making sure to highlight that there is no one Houston narrative, right? Like insofar as a Houston narrative exists, it's like the lack thereof, right? There are just too many different experiences that people are having. I think that's a really great thing, and I think it opens the doors for a lot of people to tell stories.
That's great. I mean, one of the things I love about your nonfiction about Houston is also that just how well you've captured like the different neighborhoods and the hubs of Houston. I haven't told you this before, but I have a lot of friends who I didn't realize had grown up there until I started sharing your columns, and then they started reaching out to me. Most of them are children of immigrants, and they all grew up in like very different, a lot of them were like from suburbs around, a few were from the city itself, but they were just saying, everyone was like, this is like the first time I've read anything that really captures Houston, and they all had such disparate experiences, and they all identified with different aspects of what you were writing about. I think it's an extraordinary thing to have kind of captured the feel of a city and made that real for readers of it and outside of it. I wanted to ask too, just about, shifting gears to like your characters, if there were, I loved all of them. I really loved the family and the central narrator a lot that we kind of follow through the story. Interesting, we don't get his name till the end. But I'm curious as to like if there was anything in particular that really unlocked his story or trajectory, or maybe his family story for you. Like, why were you called to tell this story and carry it through the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was, I guess, like in that central planning process of like trying to decide what I want to write about in which areas, there were some voices, like 2 or 3 voices that were significantly, I've been trying not to use the word easier because I say easy and then someone asks like, oh, was it easy? It wasn't as easy, but it was more comfortable, I guess, to write with, right? And writing is just like really difficult for me. Like I would just rather not do it. So anything that's comfortable, I just sort of learned to just sort of jump on that. So I just sort of stuck with that voice, and it was interesting, and it was fun to sort of figure out like what this particular person's problems were, what their specific experiences within the city were, navigating that particular character's queerness and the queerness of the characters around them, like how it impacted the scope of opportunities that they may have had and the scope of how they conceive of themselves, and whether that scope expanded or contracted by merit of, just like the passage of time and their experience in the city. So it was, it ended up, that particular voice and that particular family ended up being a pretty nifty, or I should probably say flexible voice to like sort of interrogate and work through other questions that I had or that I was trying to sort of tackle in the collection.
It's interesting too how many, for various characters, they go through like a lot of everything from like trauma to like the violence and displacement of gentrification to like broken families and grief and that sort of thing. Like these are really heavy topics, and I wouldn't say it's that you're writing about them with like levity. That's a little too simple. But I was really struck on especially my second read of the book, at how for some characters it's like these great big moments of upheaval that change their lives, these traumas, and for others, they kind of roll with it because they're so used to these things happening. Like, how do you strike that balance, I guess, between not veering too much toward either like melodrama or like jadedness? Because that struck me as like a really tricky balance.
Yeah, it is really, I mean, I think it can be really tricky. I think just in like in American literary fiction, like contemporary American literary fiction, when just my specific experience, like me, Bryan Washington, when I see a lot of narratives that I have read about marginalized communities or folks coming from marginalized places or minorities or double minorities, the crux and the sort of brunt of their experience within that narrative is their marginalization, right? Like you have the gay character and they're just gay, like that's it. Or you have, the Arab American character and that they're just there, right? They're like a plot device, right? So I think that I was really conscious of not just giving people humanity, right? I mean, which sounds like a simple thing, but I think it's in the writing process, it should be a simple thing, but it isn't always super present. So that was something that I was really conscious of trying to do. And I think that when you give people humanity, or when you give your characters humanity, or you give a scenario humanity, or an area humanity, it sort of transcends like the sort of whatever labels or whatever lazy labels might be thrown on a place like that, right? Like, I don't know, like if you're driving through a new neighborhood, let's say, or a new city or a place you haven't been before, and you're writing with someone who has lived there for some time, and they might say, oh yeah, that's the bad part of town, right? So when you read a novel, like that's the bad part of town, right? And that's the sort of, that's what it is, right? But it's so much more than that, right? Because you have people who live there, and they have hopes and dreams and ambitions, and they have loves, and yes, like they're whatever infrastructural and historical violence that's been inflicted on them by the city is going to inform their experiences, but it's not like their experience in and of itself. There's more implicitly and explicitly to those people, and by way of that, those characters when you're writing it. So I think that giving characters the benefit of the doubt, and giving them humanity, and not having them, I don't know that there are like any explicitly good characters or any explicitly bad characters, but I do think that writing explicitly good or explicitly bad characters can be boring, right? Because people have layers. Yeah. So trying to imbue each character with layers or replace with layers was definitely a goal.
I think that's partly what makes your fiction and your nonfiction just so generous and inviting. In terms of, which makes me wonder, like, has that always kind of been a feature of your writing? Like, what's sort of your origin story as a writer? How'd you come to it, and what was it that made you want to?
What was
every writer has an origin story.
Yeah, I guess I do. I feel like Spider-Man was. what was my origin story? I wanted to write for Grantland, and then Grantland died.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I grew like I wasn't like the best reader or the biggest reader. So if you weren't the best reader or the biggest reader, you can write a book.
Your football
but
essay would have been great for Grant.
Yeah. But Grantland died. I had the opportunity to write for the All, and specifically to write for Sylvia Killingsworth. I had the opportunity to write for Yourself, and writing for the All and writing for Catapult were deeply instructive as far as just. I know she's up here, so like talking about her is maybe counterintuitive, but no, I learned like a lot from Nicole. I learned a lot from Nicole. I learned a lot from Sylvia. So having the opportunity, and this was all nonfiction, but having the opportunity to write about myself in some instances, and also, let's say, I wrote about the State of the Union. I wrote my first food stuff for the All. I wrote about music. Got to write about movies. Got to write about like neighborhoods. I got to write about the World Cup for Catapult. So like having that, I don't know how many other places exist like that anymore, except for Catapult maybe, where you can sort of run the gamut. But I had the opportunity to do that around the time that I started, so I was really fortunate. And I mostly wrote fiction for myself, just like as something, I guess coming back to the idea of like switching between energies.
How long have you been, did you always write fiction, like even as a kid or high school? Or
No, I didn't start writing fiction until undergrad. Like I was a very bad student, but I took a class with Matt Johnson, and it was a fiction course, and he was like, hey, you might be able to do this. He may have said that like in those, he's very low key, like he may have just said you might be able to that tone of voice and everything. So I said okay, and I kept doing it. But he was like deeply invested in his students, right? And he was a mentor in like every sense of the word. So it was really cool to have someone like that be not only interested in what I was trying to do, but someone who like believed that you could do more than that. So it was really helpful. But I wasn't, even then, I don't think I was consciously like writing like a book project, or I had like a book in mind. It was just like a different way of telling. So I viewed it as like I still view it, I suppose, as like a different way of telling stories, like switching between forms. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask a couple more questions to start thinking of your questions. And they'll be brief questions, but the first one is, I normally don't like to put writers on the spot, but I know, congrats, you just sold your second book. So for people who aren't familiar yet with it, what is it about?
I don't even know if I can talk. So it is a romantic comedy. I'm really interested in romantic comedies. Just like as a form, I think you can do so much with a really good romantic comedy. You can just cover so much ground. Like you can travel the world, or you could have it just take place in like a house. So it is a romantic comedy. Most of the characters are queer. Most of them are people of color. I feel like that's all I should say about that. Yeah.
It sounds great.
Well,
And my last question was just, this is your debut, and I think, obviously publication's a wild ride every time for everyone, but just any like really either special things, great reactions, or surprising, wonderful things that have happened so far?
Surprising, wonderful things.
I know it's like a high bar,
so far.
but
Yeah, I guess two things. At the Houston event, it was really nice how many people showed up from the city and like the community. It was really nice. And there was a long signing line, right? So a lot of people like saw the signing line and they were like, I'm fucking out of here. Like, I'll come back and get like a stock copy, which is totally understandable because it's a Tuesday evening. And it's like, why would you? But I was signing stock maybe 45 minutes after the event had ended. And it was just me and the events coordinator, and just a handful of people in the store. And there was a guy who came back to the store, and he was with his partner who had been working. And he told me that his partner had been working, and he had come out to his family maybe I don't want to misquote him, but it was like not very long before. Having gotten the galley of the book. So he was like, hey, I was just working downtown. I didn't think you'd be here. And there was no really reason for him to have faith that I would be there because it's way after the event was there. He was like, but I wanted you to sign it. So that was really cool. It was really nice that someone would take the time to do that, to make a conscious effort to come back and not really know if someone's going to be there to have a book signed. And also like interacting with high school teachers has been really cool. High school teachers who are excited about the book or just excited about, stories about Houston. That's been super cool. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I have a million more questions, but I feel like we should give audience members a chance. So
I have a microphone since we are recording. If you hold up your hand, we can get the question on the audio. Great.
Hi, thank you. First of all, great job at asking questions, Nicole. Your questions were
Such a
lovely.
great job.
So I love the way you put about the characters, the humanity, and all of that, and their marginalization. Obviously, that's how they go through the world, but that's not who they are. And so, when you come up with a character, what comes to you first?
That's a really good question. I think that I'm usually immediately drawn to conversations, right? So I usually start most of my fiction with a conversation between two people, right? That's how the novel that I just finished started. That's how the first story of this book started, just a conversation between two folks. Because I think just by merit of you having two people communicating with one another or trying to communicate with one another, there is an inherent conflict, right? It might not be a large conflict. It might be, a very, very tiny thing. But just the act of communication is, you're going to have some sort of roadblock there, right? And so the question for me becomes, what were the conflicts that led to this initial conflict? And then sort of backtracking from there, I'm able to have a few ideas of what the story's central conflict might be, right? It's like a really condensed way, I suppose, of of my process for stories. Yeah. It's not always so clean, right? Like sometimes it takes a bit longer, right? Most of the fiction that I write is just born from like a conversation and what a future problem or a prior problem could be that led folks to that present moment.
So much has been written about this book as a Houston book, but really, I found it very universal, especially as far as the kind of emotional fallout from gentrification. I grew up here in DC, and the city is like not recognizable to me. And here we are in this place that until like 3 years ago was basically, bodegas and industrial warehouses. Most of the characters in your book seem to either reject the gentrification or capitalize on it in some way through the service industry. But there's no real conversation about how to interact with it when you get pleasure from some aspects of gentrification, like walking over to the market. And is that something that you thought about in it? Like, the tension of that, is that something you can talk about a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Specifically, I suppose I'd split that into two bits. There are two pieces that did not make it into the collection where the concerns of folks who had just moved to a recently gentrified neighborhood and the folks who were working directly in the service of, that family. I ended up pulling them because I did not think that, one, I didn't think it was a very good story because the way that I was approaching it, it was from, I knew where I was going to end up, right? I hadn't written them with the acumen of not making them out to be villains, right? To have the rest of these stories, you have folks who have been hurt by the gentrification in the neighborhood and just dealing with it and having this narrative about folks who are entering that space just by merit of that structure, those folks would be villains, right? And that, again, like sort of going back to what I was saying earlier, it's dishonest and it's lazy, to sort of paint them immediately as villains with no sort of interiority, right? It was something that I thought about parsing, and I probably will a little bit later on. But I think that a really fascinating part about Houston, just the way that the city's culinary system is set up, right? It's a very diverse food city, and that sounds good for television and for magazine and newspapers, but it is a functional benefit when you have a city that has such a strong immigrant population and many, many recent immigrants, right? Food service is one, or it can be one of the gigs that you can just sort of fall into with relatively little interference irrespective of your prior experiences. So it's tricky negotiating how people benefit from the changes in their neighborhood because there are tangible benefits. But I think that I wasn't in a place where I could write about that in the way that I wanted to write about it, in the way that it should have been written about. Yeah.
And I don't mean to sound like an apologist. It just made for an absolutely fascinating reading experience because I felt so much like self-implication while I was reading it, which kind of like deepened your interaction with the narrative, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it's a really tricky thing to parse because so many different neighborhoods in this country are undergoing it right now. So the idea of like how we approach gentrification and how we approach the remnants of what a neighborhood was or what it could be is, I mean, I don't think that there's a clean answer. I think it's like a constant negotiation, right? Like the new donut shop in the neighborhood benefits everyone, because now there's donuts, right? And yet, who knows who was displaced or who knows who was pushed out of the neighborhood. Yeah, it's definitely a question that I'll continue to sort of poke and prod at. Yeah, and one that I think that we'll get closer to an answer as more folks who were affected by it are allowed to tell their stories. Yeah, I think that's the best way, or I think it's the closest that we'll get to sort of finding a way to make each of these studies more equitable for everyone. Yep.
Let me think. So a lot of your fiction and nonfiction focuses on labor, right, and the workforce, and specifically working class positions like service industry, low wage or like minimum wage positions. And I've read your piece in Catapult, Watching White Kids, like which I loved. It was a really good piece about your work in this like child care facility in Houston and like the valencies of like being a black man in that space and looking at the experiences of other people of color in that space and how whiteness and also class, right, operated to create a like hostile environment, but also a very interesting environment to like analyze. And I guess I'm asking a two-pronged question. What influenced your decision to focus on like labor and like work as a part of like your work, like in both fiction and nonfiction? Because like that isn't often, like someone mentioned earlier, that isn't often something that's looked upon or like considered a suitable subject for like literature. And then what has been the response to that, and what has been the response to you like critically analyzing, exploring the valencies of identity, like racial, gendered, your sexual identity? Like, what has been the response to those things?
That's a really good question. I think the first one would probably make the most sense to tackle it first. I'm interested in work because it informs so much of the American project and our lives inside of the American project, right? Most folks in this country don't come from money, right? And most of the folks that don't come from money have to work, and work is a major component of your day-to-day experience, your day-to-day life, right? I think in a lot of the stories within the American canon that I came up reading, either work destroys a character, right? Or they don't work. Or money is implied and never stated, right? Writing about Houston, I think that one thing is a lack of the zoning in the city, right? So you have, what that means is that you can have, I think the thing that people throw out is like a strip mall next to a daycare, next to a strip club, next to a bodega, next to a skyrise, right? And that, you see a lot of different working experiences, right? You immediately see someone who never has to work next to someone who is literally selling their body, next to someone who is being paid to watch someone else's children, and so on. So I don't know that it would make much sense to me writing the book that I wanted to write and not have work be a central part of that experience, right? I think that work is one of the spaces that the characters interrogate who they are and who they would like to be, right? Through the act of working and through the moments that are peripheral and adjacent to the work that they're doing. As far as writing about identity, I think that I'm deeply, insofar as there's a through line to my nonfiction and fiction and the things that I've gotten to do, it's that I'm deeply interested in doing what I want to do. And what I want to do is write about the communities that I care about, right? And those are more often than not communities in Houston, more often than not the queer folks in Houston, more often than not, it's people that are negotiating their identities and specifically the sort of creases in between their identities, right? Figuring out how it works for them or how it doesn't work for them. So criticism is something that obviously with the book coming out, I'm starting to see more of it. But my bottom line at this point in my writing life is that I'm only interested in doing what I want to do. And I don't know that it'll impact my obsessions, right? Because you really don't have much control over what you're drawn to, I don't think, or I certainly don't in my writing. I end up gravitating towards the same things. So and what little criticism I've read and what reviews I've read, people seem to be either interested in it or deeply confused by it, right? Like the sort of how these different things are intersecting with one another. Like, what does it mean to have like a working class narrative that's also a queer narrative, that's also taking place in a gentrified city, that's also trying to be funny sort of in different parts? And that response to me is a bit confusing, right? Because you go through so many things in a single day, right? Like even if you have the shitty day, like the absolute worst day, maybe something funny happened, right? So there are 365 days in most years, right? So having a narrative or having a sensibility that only focused on one of those tenors wouldn't make much sense to me, given what I'm interested in, if that makes sense. Hopefully that wasn't too convoluted. Yeah, thanks.
Hi there. I was just wondering who your favorite Grantland writers are.
Who is my favorite? That's such a good question. I feel like Shea Serrano is the default because he's from Houston. I really like Huasu's work. I think that he's a genius. I really enjoy Shea Serrano and Huasu. I wanted to be like Shea Serrano for a little while, but he's just like too good. So I just watch. Yeah, I just watch what he's doing. But really, I mean, their whole. Their whole roster is just like so extraordinary. And there's so much extraordinary writing online right now. I mean, irrespective of whether it's at, the contemporary iteration of Grantland, I guess we could say The Ringer is that at this point. The New Yorker's web staff, like they're just brilliant. The folks that are writing for Catapult are just brilliant. There's just a lot of really exciting stuff. And it's really cool how communities are cultivated out of people having opportunities to write about what they want to write about, even if they don't fit a sort of mainstream narrative, even if they're disparate or just maybe not within arm's reach of whatever is like trending right now or like whatever is like immediately gonna garner views or hits or whatever. So I felt like Grantland was a space like that. I felt like The All was a space like that. And I think that we need more spaces like that, just to have folks have the opportunity to play, because I feel like that. So I was really lucky in that I had, spaces to play. And from that, I was able to just sort of work on what ultimately became a craft and work on what ultimately became the work that I was doing. And I don't know that I would have had those opportunities if those spaces hadn't existed or if the qualifications that I needed to get into those spaces were super high tier for entry, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. Because you had mentioned before in your answer, right, an answer to your question, and then kind of earlier to Nicole's question about these like comforts that you have that you're drawn to like in writing. And I think that's such an interesting concept because I feel like a lot of times you're supposed to like stretch yourself when writing. You're like, oh, I'm not supposed to do a comfortable route or whatever, but that doesn't make any sense because like if you're drawn to something, like you said, you should just be drawn to it. Do you find that you like found those interests by writing, or is it by reading, or like a combination? I don't know.
That's a really good question. I think it was by both, right? Like lately I've been writing more about food. I didn't know that was something that I could do until I had the opportunity to do it, right? Because I just did not see a whole lot of people like me that were doing that, right? There was Michael Twitty, and that was the only person that I saw. So I was like, okay, the barrier for entry, like, he's brilliant. So like, so having the opportunity to do those things like reading outside of myself specifically, and reading everything, I feel like that is because I wasn't a reader coming up, so I didn't know what I liked to read or what I would write because I had no conception of the different forms or the different types of narratives that you could have out there, the different voices that you could play with and form. So just reading everything and just like reading deeply was really helpful, and having the opportunity, like you said, like to write in multiple spaces, write in different forms, right outside of I suppose marketability, right? I was really fortunate to work with editors whose primary concern was the work itself in lieu of how much attention the work could garner. I feel like those are two, that Venn diagram is not usually a perfect circle, right? And I was just really lucky to work with folks who that wasn't like their primary concern. It wasn't, how can we edit this piece, or how can we construe your interests in a way that intersects with what is happening immediately in the world right now, or immediately what is in movie theaters right now, or immediately what people are listening to right now, as opposed to how can we just make what you're trying to do the best version of it that we can possibly do, right? And it was through having the opportunity to do that over and over and over and over again, just sort of the repetition of it, that I got to do the things I wanted to do. I think a really fascinating thing that it's always been fascinating to me is the way in which the writing process has sort of been separate. It sort of exists on a weird plane, right? Like this idea that if, you sit down and you don't write, then eventually you'll have a book. That sort of thing, right? Or you sit down and you don't, or you only write sometimes, it'll just come to you and you'll be able to do it. But there's really no other creative practice where that seems to be the case, right? Like if you want to be a painter, you got to paint a shit ton, right? If you want to be a lead guitarist, then, you got to practice. If you want to be a drummer, you got to practice. I mean, if you want to shoot 3-pointers, then, you got to shoot 3-pointers. And yet when you sit down to write the memoir that you've wanted to write for your entire life, you're just going to sit down, you're just going to do it, right? So all of that to say that the repetition really helped me as well. Not only having the opportunity to write for those places, but having the opportunity to do it many, many, many times, and to fuck up, and to have the opportunity to try again, right? It was through repetition and through messing up that I think I got significantly closer to pulling off the kinds of pieces that I wanted to write, or getting close enough to where I could look back and say, okay, like this piece was mostly what I was trying to do. I think there are 2 pieces I've written that I could look at and I could say, wow, like I did exactly what I was trying to do. But I wouldn't have even gotten to those 2 if I'd fucked up on the first one, right? This is after X amount of opportunities to, try and work at it. And the goal becomes like trying to make better work. So working fuels, my interests.
We have time for one more question, if there's another. Great.
I just want to gauge your opinion and thoughts on a current cultural phenomenon, and that being the increasing interest in the cultural and artistic work of queer people, and specifically queer people of color. Why do you think that is, and what do you think has led to this cultural interest?
That's a really good question that's full of landmines. I think that one thing that I will say is that as a queer kid growing up in the States who did not have easy access to queer narratives, the fact that many of those barriers certainly haven't collapsed. They've elided in many senses, right? I think that is a good thing, right? And I think access to those kinds of narratives will always be a good thing. I also think that I'm always a little bit wary of when a model or a comp or a concept is accepted as the queer narrative, because I think that in elevating certain narratives, and this isn't explicitly always relegated to queer narratives, right? Any narrative where you have folks that are coming from marginalized communities or minorities or double minorities and so on, you run the risk of gridlocking narratives that are outside of that comp or outside of that proven successful model. So it's a different form of blocking people from telling their stories, right? So if we have a narrative, let's say, about a queer kid going to a very accepting high school with very accepting parents, and everything is just great on that front, but he has a minor conflict with minimal diversity in that narrative, and it's a hit. That's great because more people get to see that particular queer narrative. But a danger is that that becomes the queer narrative, and every queer narrative that isn't filtered through that vice is not acceptable, right? And every variation on that only moves the barometer a little bit further, right? Like now, let's say maybe we'll only add one other queer character of color who has like half a speaking role, and that's like progress. It's not progress, right? It's reinforcing what we've established as the new stereotype. So I think that what I think is always going to be a challenge and always going to be a goal, beyond allowing more people to tell their stories, is allowing them to tell the stories that they would like to tell in the way that they would like to tell with the people that they would like to tell it about, right? Which means having queer characters of color, right? Which means having non-monogamous relationships, because that's not something that you see in American contemporary narratives more often than not, if it's not like in a farcical light, right? It means not having everyone be the same body type in the narrative, right? Because depending on what you're watching, you would think that everyone is living the same lifestyle or has the same opportunities, and that is not at all the case, right? So it'll be interesting to see where our country's interest in queer narratives goes. But I do think that telling the stories that you would like to tell in the way that you would like to tell will always be a battle as far as telling stories in this country are concerned, but I think it is one that is worth engaging in. That was a great question. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thank you all. Yeah,
Thank
it's like, thanks. Thank you.